Good morning. My name is Daniel Brint and I'm in Madrid. I'm going to be talking to you this morning about stories. The title of my talk, as you can see, is the telling tale. There's a purpose for that slight double meaning, because what I'd like to look at today is not just how we tell tales, stories, but why we tell them and how they become significant. The telling tale for me is the idea that a story which becomes something with meaning, with significance that we can explore. I'd like to divide the talk into 4 sections. First of all, I'm going to consider some of the cultural questions related to stories and tales. Secondly, I'm going to look at the structure of stories and think a bit about how they're shaped. And then thirdly, I'm going to suggest some pre, during, and post-reading activities that we can use as teachers when working with stories in the classroom. And finally, not finally, but the 4th thing is I'm going to look at an example of a lesson, a very short, a kind of complete lesson. And finally, I'm available for questions and answers. So if anybody wants to raise a question as I'm talking, please remember to send this through the chat. I will be making these slides available, the presentation available to participants. And at the end, I'll give you an email address where you can contact me. First of all, I should begin by pointing out that when I'm talking about stories here, for the purposes of this presentation, it's a very inclusive definition. So this is anything from myths, legends, fables, moral tales, through to Gothic stories or modernist short stories or contemporary short stories. And I'm also going to be looking at and thinking about visual short stories, animation in particular, the use of short animated films as a way of working with stories in the classroom. As I said, I just first of all like to, excuse me, to consider a little bit the cultural background to storytelling. This is a picture some of you might be familiar with. It's from the Altamira caves in the north of Spain. And this is dated at about 35,000 years old. I find it very moving to look at this picture because it makes me think about how even 35,000 years ago, people were effectively telling stories about their daily lives and about the world around them, about their habitat and their environment. And it's a very interesting as well from a representational point of view, because as the writer Keith Oakley has pointed out, this is probably the first example we have in human culture of where this becomes that, as he puts it. The idea that this is human beings learning to use metaphor. Something becomes something else. And for me, that's the origin of the story. It's the fact that this ability to externalize a process and then look at it and imagine what happens within it is fundamental to stories and storytelling. So there's another point to this, which I think is, is interesting, is that these pictures on the wall are of the animals that constituted the lives of the people who drew them. And even there, I think we have a very early example of how narrative is constructed and of how point of view and narrative voice begins. So I think these are really to be treasured, these examples of early this becoming that, lives, experience becoming stories. And stories form an enormously important part of culture from that point on. And we find the development of the oral tradition. This is something which is used for many reasons. The storytelling could be a form of passing on knowledge of traditions, stories about the origins of a culture, creation myths, but also practical knowledge. Stories could also include warnings about dangers, about how to do things and how not to do things. And what's fascinating there as well is that This appears everywhere in the world. It's not limited at all by geography or culture. We find this process of storytelling going on everywhere. So it's something which is really fundamental to the human psychology. Which moment changed this significantly? Well, it's this, of course, the printing press. And with the printing press, a completely new form of storytelling is introduced. And we move away from this collective form of storytelling, which is constructed in time and space, because a group is listening to someone telling a story, so people are in the same space, in the same time. And the printing press effectively liberates the story from these restrictions. And that means that it could be turned into a very private and personal process. And you can decide to start reading a story, you can then put it away and come back to it. You can move it around. So it represents a sea change in how stories were made available and processed by readers. There's a phrase that, well, sorry, just before I come to that, we tell stories all the time. And it's such a fundamental part of how we live. And it's not something that's limited by, again, by age, class, social background, anything. We're constantly constructing stories about our lives. When we tell anybody about something we've done, something we're going to do, something we want to do, something we're doing, it's formed as a type of narrative. And as I said, this is independent of other considerations such as age. It happens at all aspects of life. The psychologist Stuart Brown said this: the unit of intelligibility of most of our brains is the story. And I think that's a very nice idea to explore a bit, the idea of a story as a type of unit. And that's going to, for me, suggest the idea of shapes. Now, probably a lot of you will be familiar with these kind of graphic organizers. You can see how they allow students to plan or plot the way a story is developed through following a shape. Now, the one on the left is fairly simple. You can see that it presupposes a kind of a structure where you have a rising action, a falling action, a resolution. The second example is more complex, and it allows for different stages in that process. This could, obviously, this could also involve flashbacks and flash forwards. It doesn't have to be linear, but these kind of graphic organizers are very effective ways of helping students to understand the development of a plot, the development of a narrative, and see it as a kind of physical shape. And I think that's a very useful way of working with stories. Now, the writer Kurt Vonnegut, he took this idea of the shape of stories and developed it initially as a slightly humorous exercise, but in the end, he made some very useful points about the shapes of stories. He, for example, identifies two very important story shapes that we find again and again and again. The first one he calls man in a hole. It's basically, you know, you have a problem, and you find a solution, you get out of the hole, and you're rewarded for your effort. Very similar, if you look at the shape of the second one, Boy Meets Girl, it's very, very similar. The difference here is that at the beginning of the story, someone loses something precious. They lose a treasure, and then they have to find it again, which is the dip. And once they found it again, they have permanent happiness. Now, it may seem rather facile, but this is actually describes an enormous number of stories, these two shapes. Vonnegut doesn't stop there. He also points out that there are different story shapes. From bad to worse, well, it's like metamorphosis. You wake up in the morning and discover you've turned into a giant cockroach. Things just get worse from there on. So that's not the most kind of maybe inspiring sort of story shape. And lastly, what we probably associate with more complex narratives, where the shape of the story is very much a matter of conjecture and interpretation. We're not sure a lot of the time whether the story is going the way we want it to go or it should go, and we're not clear whether people or characters are reliable or we can believe them. So that's a much more sophisticated type of story, which we can kind of work with. So for my introductory part there, what I want to emphasize is that maybe in the classroom, the key opportunity we have with stories is to combine the storytelling experience that is associated with the oral tradition with the reading experiences we've developed through the book and through visual media. That for me is the real kind of opportunity we have here. And I'll be saying a little bit more about why I think that is the case. In Tammy's talk earlier, I was very interested to hear her highlighting emotion and learning, and I'm absolutely agree with her comments there. And there's a nice little visual map of this. I think this is an educator, Sunny Brown, and she talks about in one of her, is it actually in a TED talk, and she highlights the fact that if you want people to get really engaged with a topic, if you want them to remember it, then you need to combine, ideally, to combine two of the elements on the left with an emotion. And this significantly increases memory and engagement. Now, that's something that stories do, and it's a very rewarding process. And I'll be talking a little bit more later about why this might be the case. So moving on to talking a little bit about how do we get into a story when we're working with students. Now, one obvious answer might be, well, you just give them something to read or something to watch. And of course, there are no right or wrong rules about this. And we might find there are occasions where we do just want to give students a text and ask them to read it and then do some work on it. But part of the effectiveness of stories is that they allow us to predict and anticipate and generate our own ideas about what's happening and how characters feel. So pre-reading activities become very important to draw the students into the story. And I'd just like to highlight a few of these for you. Here's the most kind of obvious is a picture, just using pictures related to the text, which will stimulate ideas and conjecture and prediction. Now, this is a picture I use with a Japanese ghost story. Well, yes, it's a kind of ghost story, Yuki-onna, translated by Lafsadio Hearn. And it's about a spirit woman who marries a fisherman. And I like this picture very much because you can't see a face. And that always brings up a lot of speculation. Well, it could begin with obvious questions about where is this? Which country do students think it's in? What do they think this woman is doing? What kind of place they think this is? What kind of time? And then focus in on the face. Why can't we really see a face here? Is it just the quality of the picture, or could it be that she's not exactly human? So it's a way of drawing students into the theme of the story and the character. Here's another example. This is a Russian short story, or I think it's Russian or Polish, called The Snow Girl. And it's a story about a woman who makes a snow girl who comes to life, and then, as you can imagine, melts once it comes to spring. And this is this kind of one of many beautiful pictures you can find of this image, and again speculating, who is she, where is she, what is she? Is she made of snow, or is she simply wearing some kind of extraordinary white dress? So a lot of speculation, questioning, and wondering what's going on there. So these are some examples of visual input. Now, as the graphic I showed you before highlights, there are other types of engagement that we can work with. This is something I like to do when possible, and it's to collect a group of objects that are related to the story that we're going to read. Now, this is a story about a girl who has a kind of magical journey to a strange land and meets all kinds of adventure, has all kinds of adventures. And so I, collected together a bunch of objects here. And ideally, the thing here is for students to actually pick these up and look at them and think about them and talk about them and try and imagine how they could fit into a particular story. So this is something tactile and something that can, where the objects can stimulate ideas before we start reading the story. We mentioned before in that graphic also audio and sound. I'm just going to stop this for a second to share something else with you. YouTube is wonderful for atmospheric sound effects and background noises. Here's one that I used when I was working with the Canterbury Tales, and I wanted to get students imagining, picturing in their minds a kind of medieval setting. And in order to do that, I played them this. I'll just play I think I forgot to share sound, if you'll just excuse me a moment. So the idea was to get them to listen and try to imagine what's going on. What can they hear? What can they identify in terms of what people are doing? What sort of objects do they see? What kind of atmosphere is it? So I'll just play you a little clip from So just to give you a little idea of what those kind of sounds sound like, and playing that for a few minutes, and then students trying to describe what they saw, what kind of atmosphere it is, before moving on to working with the story. If you're using animation, the use of sound can be even more productive, because a lot of animated films, which if you don't use them or haven't tried using them, see what you can find on YouTube. There are some wonderful films, and they're generally very short, between maybe 3 and 5 minutes. And they're very often the soundtrack is extremely important. There's not very, there's a sparse use of dialogue. And there's a film I'll just play a little bit to you now. This is a kind of science fiction film, futuristic animated film, sort of dystopian futuristic film. And it begins with some very good sound effects and noises, which I play to the students with the screen blank, so they don't see the picture, they only hear the sounds. Before they hear, we go through a list of questions. I prefer to put these on the board and just run through them, because when students listen, I prefer them to close their eyes and try and imagine the scene. So you don't have to do it that way. They could have the questions in front of them, but I just prefer it that way because I think it produces more imaginative descriptions. So you go through these, you kind of think about, well, what time of day do they imagine it is? Things like colors, weather, feelings, emotions, sounds, who's there, what kind of atmosphere is it? And then once they've finished, it gives a clear interest in seeing the beginning of the film to check to what extent their predictions were correct. So it's a really nice way to lead into the story, generating some ideas about what it might be about, and at the same time, focusing attention on the kind of setting that's going to be experienced there. I can't blank the screen for you, but you could always, if you prefer to close your eyes as you listen to this, you can. But I'm just going to find that that example on YouTube and just play you the opening part. So as I said, you have to bear in mind that the students don't see the screen, they're only hearing the sounds. And I play them about the first 1.5 minutes. Well, I'll stop it there. Just to go back, there are some nice noises that come up after that with electronic sounds and strange bleeping noises, but at the same time you have this violin music and a mixture of movements. There are no voices, there are only these kind of electronic sounds. So it produces what always intrigues me when I'm doing this in class is how similar people's interpretations are, or how the pictures they generate are very, very similar. I don't think I've ever had someone say they imagined it happening in daylight. People always think it's happening in the dark or at night. So it's a really interesting exercise to see how our imaginative world can be influenced by the auditory. So I'm just going to go back to my presentation now. So those are the kind of questions that I was working with there. So these are just some examples of pre-reading. I'm not saying they're necessarily the best, and they may not work for every type of story. Clearly, the last one needs to be with a film. Although, as you saw with the ambient sound, you can also use sounds with a written text, like a Canterbury Tales story. Something visual, something auditory, something tactile is perfect for leading into working with the story. From there, I'd like to move on to reading the text and pause maybe just slightly to think about those issues raised earlier about what is special about stories, why is emotion activated in particular when we're reading them. And I think a lot of that is to do with formal elements. There are things like points of view, perspective, engagement, the way that a character will tell a story, formal elements like first person, narrative, third person, use of maybe present tenses to emphasize immediacy. So all of these formal elements. But within that, the great thing for me is that stories have this extra dimension that they allow us to move into them, to locate ourselves within the narrative. This is a big difference for me from, say, non-fictional and fictional texts, or from narrative texts and other types of texts like expository, because there is this opportunity to become part of the story. Now, that's not a fanciful idea. It might have seemed a fanciful idea some time ago, but recent developments in neuroscience and our ability to analyze processes happening within the brain at certain moments have shown that there are certain areas of the brain that are activated when people read stories that are different from when they read, say, purely informational texts. And this is linked to chemical processes. I'm not an authority or expert at all, but I do know, I have read quite a lot about this, and you have things like dopamine and the way that it comes from a story. We generate it when we're reading a story because we're focusing and we're trying to solve problems and we're imagining how we're going to resolve that. Storytelling in an evolutionary sense can also be seen as developing our ability to predict things that might happen in the future and be prepared for them. So it's a kind of practical way of activating our anticipation. This is linked very much to what I've been talking about, is really about theory of mind as well, about our ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes And that's an experience I think a lot of us have had when reading stories, is that it's not simply that you're following what's happening to a character, but you are actually in some way sensing and experiencing what that character is experiencing. How can we utilize this, or how can we bring that out when we're reading a text? Well, here's one activity that I use quite a lot if the story is suitable, and I call it, well, it's called, or let's call it, interrogating the story. I explain to students what I want them to do is to ask questions of a sentence. They have to think about what information doesn't the sentence give them, what does it give them, but what's missing, and what kind of questions could we ask this sentence. So this is an example of how I would use that with a short story by Ernest Hemingway. This is the first sentence of the story. And I probably model the activity with this first sentence so students get the idea, but they usually very quickly get the hang of it. Which questions could we ask? Well, why is he sitting by the side of the road? Why are his clothes dusty? Where is the road? Which country? Which time? Well, we see steel-rimmed spectacles, so we might say, well, that's not absolutely modern, but let's say that means it probably sometime in the last 100 years, but we can't be certain. Where is he going? Where has he come from? Are there other people around? If his clothes are very dusty, does that mean it's very hot? So you begin by getting into the story by trying to imagine what questions you'd want to ask and find answered. And then you move on to the next sentence. Aha. Well, here you probably have to explain that a pontoon bridge is a improvised bridge made by normally engineers to cross a river. But the pontoon bridge, okay, so what have we learned now? Right, well, there are carts and trucks. So that's located, so we know now maybe approximately when the story has happened. It's sometime after the invention of the motor car. But a lot more questions come out of this. Why are they building a bridge? Why have they built a bridge? Why haven't they just gone to probably if it's a river, there's a bridge somewhere. Why are they crossing it here? They're carts and trucks. What are in the carts? What are in the trucks? And who do they belong to? And why are the men, women, and children crossing it? What are they doing? Are they running away from something, or are they trying to reach something? And how many are there? We don't have any information about numbers. So again, drawing out in the context, but actually drawing you into it as you move into the story. And in the third sentence, okay, we've got a bit more information now. The carts aren't being moved by people, they're being moved by mules. And okay, soldiers. So we now put together the pontoon bridge, the soldiers, maybe crossing a river, maybe they are escaping from something. And they're helping. You can see that but why are they helping? Why are the soldiers helping the people? Why aren't the people going one way and the soldiers going the other? And so little by little, the story opens up and the readers become more involved in it. This story is short enough to do the whole story like this, if you want to, maybe introducing some slightly longer chunks as you go along. But it works very nicely as well, as you can hear, you're using questions as well. So even the simplest level is a grammar exercise. But I think more importantly, it draws the reader into the world of the story, and they begin to experience the setting, the context, the problem, if it's a problem, or the challenge, if it's a challenge, or the mystery, if it's a mystery, as a result of this process. Another way of reading is our wonderful resource of jigsaws. We can jigsaw texts in various ways. You can, if the text is short enough, we can cut them up into paragraphs, as you know, and then you have to jumble them up and the students have to sequence them again. This is, as well as being a very nice way of focusing the story, it's also, of course, a very useful reading exercise and grammar exercise, because students are having to look very carefully at anaphoric and cataphoric references to try and place different paragraphs in order and in sequence. Another way of jigsawing a text is to break it up into sections. So if you have 4 students in a group, to cut up the story into 4 parts, and they have to reassemble it by sharing their parts of the stories. So that's another more kind of traditional reading exercise, if you like. Another way of working with a story is to choose when to pause. I think it's important to be very parsimonious with texts. I think you give them away very grudgingly in order to achieve the maximum effect and anticipation. And this is, well, you see on the left, this is our graphic organizer from earlier on. And it's the one that shows the kind of structure of a rising action leading to some kind of critical moment, some sort of crisis, which then needs to be resolved. Now, this is a perfect point to stop the story before the resolution. Many stories have this structure, so I think it's a widely applicable method. And then to introduce this drama activity called a conscience alley. The conscience alley works like this. You have one person, normally a student, but it could be you as the teacher if you prefer to do it that way. Let's imagine a story where a girl has gone to a school in a city. Her parents are farmers and they've saved up to send her away to the school. She arrives at the school and is very unhappy there. And at the kind of the peak point of the story, in a way, is, does she decide to go back or does she decide to stay and fight? And this is the kind of dilemma that she has. Is she going to return home to her village, or is she going to stay where she is and try and make something of the situation? And what you do for this is you divide the class into 2 groups, and each group has to come up with reasons for or against. So you have a for group and an against group. And every person in the group has to have one clear reason they're going to give to the protagonist for why she should stay or why she should go. And then you create the alley on the 2 sides. You have the for and against lines. And then the protagonist, who is the protagonist in the story, she has to imagine herself as the character in the story, walks down the alley. And well, it's logical. She can either go all the way down the for side and then down and go back down the against side and then make her decision, or she can alternate. Alternating is quite nice because you then got this kind of contrast. So the protagonist here is considering the options in the same way that we as readers, if we were reading this privately, we would be considering the options of the character and thinking, well, she should do or she shouldn't do that. But you turn it into a drama exercise where everybody participates, and ultimately the whole class is thinking about what is the character going to do. It also generates, as you can imagine, a lot of interest when you go back to the story, because now we want to see what the protagonist, what the character actually does. So again, it's producing that dopamine shot where you're focused and you want to see what is the resolution at the end. So those are some activities. Again, as I said at the beginning, these are just a few ideas for building into this shape of the story, and this is one which is can happen at a key point in a story before you move on to the final resolution. After reading, again, there are many ways we can work with a text, obviously. I've kind of resisted mentioning reading comprehension. Not that it's not a good thing to do, and in a way I think there are so many ways in which we engaged in reading comprehension without them having to be traditional questions. However, I think that if we use stories and literary texts in general, I think if we use them purely for reading comprehension, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think that we're probably wasting an opportunity. So I prefer to look for other kinds of post-reading activities that involve comprehension, but it's not the more traditional sort that we'd expect to find in a textbook. One thing I use a lot, if the story allows it, and most stories do, because most stories have some kind of timeline, is to work with sequencing. So which came first? And the animation I played you the soundtrack from earlier, Worlds Apart, is an example of this. I'll show you how I use this in a class. I took a series of, just before that, why is this sequencing so useful? I think that just bear in mind the fact that we can either have a linear structure, a chronological structure, which is what's called an event structure, and this goes 1, 2, 3, 4, or we can have a discourse structure. The first type of structure is usually used for simpler stories, and probably more appropriate for young learners, so that the timeline is very clear and isn't too challenging to organize the events. The second, the discourse structure, is what we expect and enjoy as we become more sophisticated readers. So this is how we see flashbacks, flash forwards, reflections, description are used in a constructive way. Oatley, again, there's a quote from an Oatley essay here. He found that readers generally, he's talking about mostly, I think, adult readers here, but they judged that the 1, 2, 3, 4 texts were not really stories. Even if they contained a narrative, they weren't really seen to be stories, whereas the discourse structure was resulted in people identifying stories. So I think that's an interesting thing to bear in mind, and it explains why this question of sequencing can be very, very productive. So just to come back to the animated film, here are a series of screenshots from that film, and the task after watching is to reorder them. It's going to be surprisingly difficult because our visual memory is often distracted or involves other elements. So to put things back in order is actually rather more challenging than it looks. The way that I follow this up, or you can follow this up, is to then build onto this, rather than build onto it another sequencing, but this time the descriptions are written. So we're now combining the pictures and the text. This is probably quite a good moment to be moving into something, some element of syntax or lexis that you want to focus on. A great advantage of animation is that the input is visual, so students can process story and narrative without using language, but then we bring the language in later. And so there's a nice transition to be made between thinking about or understanding something through L1 and then processing it in L2. So this is probably a nice moment after working with the screenshots to begin working with the language of the text, or coming back to the language, because after all, this animation, the language is somewhere else. So that's another type of sequencing activity. I'm going to look at the final of this section. Finally, is to think about post-reading activities. I mean, another type of post-reading activity, which is again using or utilizing drama or utilizing performance rather than a kind of other comprehension exercises we've just been looking at. This is a thing called reading for several voices. Now, the Snow Girl story, which you saw the picture of earlier, this is the very end of the story. And the way to use this with a class is, it's a one-page story. So it's very short, very beautiful and very short, but it can then be broken up into about 5 short sections. And each group is made up of approximately 4 students. And their task is to perform their text. And they do it by a combination of individual, unison, or variations thereon reading. So to explain this table, each number is a student. And so student number 1, let's call him Jose, is going to read the first 3 words alone. And then this was actually, sorry, I should say this was exactly what a group did in a class. So this was their work, not mine. And they decided that student number 1 would read the first part, winter finally came, and then 2, 3, and 4 in unison would read, and the snow began to fall. But what was interesting is that they were paying very close attention to meaning and atmosphere. So they didn't just read, and the snow began to fall. They read, and the snow began to fall. They decided as a group they wanted it to sound like that. And the snow began to fall because they felt it sounded like snow falling. And so they were actually paying very close attention to meaning, sound, atmosphere, nuance as well, very sophisticated aspects, but doing it through thinking about how it was going to sound, how they were going to present this as a shared meaning, as a shared reading. And then again, they have here, one is the kind of base narrator. So again, one night the old woman had a dream. And then they had 2 students reading this part here, and then a different student reading alone, Cry for me no longer, mother. And what they did then, which was completely their own invention, is they decided they were going to repeat that with 3 of them, but they were going to whisper it. So the 3 of them in unison were whispering, Cry for me no longer, mother. And when I was watching them doing that, it reminded me of a comment that Mario Rimvolucci made, sorry about that pronunciation, was in his book on dictation. He makes a lovely comment about the fact that students very rarely have the opportunity to whisper or shout in a second language. And he suggests some dictation activities that involve quite a lot of whispering and shouting. And the idea is that you actually you experience more the language in a different way. If you're used to simply using your default monotone accent, which in many cases is what it is, because that's the one you know you're clear in and people understand you, you rarely get the chance to vary how you speak a language. And these kind of drama activities are great for that because they allow students to explore and experiment with language in different ways. Another resource for post-reading activities that I would highly recommend is readwritethink.org, where you can find a great number of activities you can build into using a story. Here are some of my favorites. This is cubes, and you choose a cube and you write questions on them, and then you answer the questions, you stick the cube together, and you can build up a collection of them. Each time you read a story, or each group writes a story, they produce a cube describing it, and then this can become a source of ideas and suggestions for reading. And also they do things like trading cards, as you can see here, which is a rather nice one. So I'm going to move on fairly quickly because I'd like to leave a few minutes at the end for questions. But I'd said that I'd end by just running through a practical example of a lesson using a story. I've chosen a visual one. And as I said, I will go through this fairly quickly. I'd begin this lesson with pictures. And I ask the students to compare and contrast what's happening in these pictures. So it's a nice, slightly kind of Cambridgey, compare and contrast exercise. And to contextualize the idea of people communicating, people in groups, people sharing, or people being together alone. So those are the pictures that I'd introduce it with. I then use an introductory text, but which you can just read out, or you can just give it to the students. But I think a much nicer way of introducing the story would be to turn this text into either a dictogloss. If you haven't used dictoglosses, Google them, because it's a really nice activity for many reasons, which I won't go into now because it's quite a long, I have a lot of ideas about this, but they're basically, it's a type of dictation, but it's not formal traditional dictation. It involves reading quite quickly and students working in groups to reconstruct a text. And this works perfectly because 112 words is about the right length for a dictogloss. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it here is a sequencing. Again, I've randomized the sentences, and so now the students try and construct a sequence that they think will work. And that's the pre-reading, or in this case, previewing activities. Obviously, this idea of playing with language and pictures varies on whether you're using a written text or using a visual text. So this is the introduction. I then take a screenshot from the video and ask students to imagine what the character in the middle is thinking and what he's thinking about. And so this is the next kind of previewing exercise. This has very nice music, but I haven't exploited the music. Maybe you'll have ideas about how to do it, but I'm just going to play you this 2-minute film so you can see how it could be used in a lesson. Okay.
No, that's not how you. First, you have to select the fabric. No, I'll explain. First,
It's a very nice example of one of those, someone loses something special, someone finds something special. It's one of those Vonnegut story shapes again. Many ways you can use this as well, I've tried different activities to follow this up with. This is actually, I think, a good example of where you can use a rather more formal aspect of language to exploit this film. So I use it with an exercise really about register. And I take these two different groups. First of all, it's a matching exercise. You have these combinations on the left, prepositional, a mixture of phrasal verbs and prepositional verbs on the left, with a slightly less formal register in some cases and a rather more formal register on the right. So first of all, it's a matching exercise, and then it's a retelling exercise. And I ask the students to choose a character from the story, from the video, and to narrate the story from that character's point of view. It can be a little bit complicated, but it's a nice one because you can maybe ask them, if they choose an adult, to use slightly more formal language or less formal language. So it can be developed in various ways. But another way this story can be used, and it was used by a teacher I gave this activity to, was linking to a science class. So she combined it with a science lesson about growing vegetables, so and about how vegetables grow. So it tied in very nicely with another curricular topic. So I've tried to leave a few minutes over in case there are any questions that anyone would like to ask me.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So many comments, both on the YouTube chat and in the chat here in the room. It's lovely. We're all really enjoying all of the resources you're sharing. And I do have a couple of questions. So the first one is from Mayalene, and is asking about the age for these strategies. At what age are these strategies useful?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it's a judgment you, as a teacher, would clearly make. But I've seen, for example, the Conscience Alley, the drama activity, the Conscience Alley. I've seen that used with very young primary students, working with a pretty simple story. In fact, it was the one I mentioned. It was actually the story of the girl having to decide if she was going to stay or not. So I think that it's a judgment call you have to make as a teacher. But I think that a lot of particularly the drama activities can be used with all ages, which is one of the really nice things about them. I mean, I've mentioned quite a number of activities, but just going back to pictures again. I think the great thing for me about visual input is that point I made about you process the initial information in L1, so you're not put off by the fact there are words you don't understand, and then as a teacher you can build in the words later. So pictures, I think, also work with very young students.
Yeah, lovely. Okay, and looking at, just a second, I'm looking through my questions here. Well, first of all, people are asking, please, for links or references to the both the story, the Snow Girl, and the video. So if we could share, I don't know if you have them to actually share in the chat box, or if not, then we'll definitely find a way of sharing them later.
Yeah, I mean, I think the same as before. Maybe I can just quickly put up an email where people can contact me.
Lovely. Do you want to put that in the chat box? For anybody who's in Zoom, the chat box, you can activate it by clicking on the More options. If you go to the options and you see 3 dots and either the word more or whatever more is in your language. In here, my computer speaks to me in Spanish, so I get más. and, let's see, here we
I've just
go.
posted my email address. I'm very happy to put together the links to those different texts. I also have some, the Snow Girl story I have a copy of, and I'm very happy to send that out.
Lovely. Where is the Snow Girl story from?
Well, I think it's Russian or Polish, probably
Mm-hmm.
Russian. It's a beautiful story because it's one of those very old winter becomes spring stories.
Yes.
And the rebirth. So it links into long traditions of the winter and the spring and the overworld and the underworld and
Lovely.
the fine line between them.
And another question I have, which you did answer partly with the last example, but Maya Len was asking about the possibility of linking stories with other content across the curricula.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been recently tutoring on a master's, and a lot of teachers were doing that with the stories we were working with. The Snow Girl, precisely, people use this for studying the seasons, for talking about, and also for this cultural question of, you know, myths and legends about the change from winter to spring. And as I said, the seed one fits in perfectly with if you're doing a topic elsewhere about science or about biology and about farming, anything linked to that. So, and I think, again, that's what I was trying to get across, was that by getting people maybe emotionally involved in a topic, it makes them more willing to deal with perhaps the slightly more informational parts, that you can build on that emotional participation to then work with other things that might be a bit off-putting if you started with them.
Lovely. And I just have one last quick question stroke comment. So Claire on the YouTube channel was thinking that a lot of these ideas could also work for plays, and you know, sort of making the most of the fact that there are quite a few plays being broadcast online at the moment for free.
Yes, and I focused here on stories principally because they work very well within the restrictions of a lesson or 2 or 3 lessons. So they could definitely be used with other formats. Maybe stories have the advantage of they tend to be very complete, and you know, that idea of a story having a very clear structure that you can work with. So I mean, I love working with plays and I love working with novels, but short stories are, for purely practical reasons, a very good resource to use in class or over 2 or 3 classes.
Lovely.
But I totally agree with Claire.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Daniel. I'm afraid we're coming to the end of our time. So some fantastic ideas there. I know that lots of people got emotional with the video as well. And once again, thank you very much. And thank you to the participants. And we have a short break now. I'd just like to remind everyone that you can take part in the chat, but you will need to open your chat box, and there's also a question and answer box. We were able to collect the questions from YouTube as well, so please, if you're staying with us, stay active in the chat. It's lovely to see people chatting away. Even if we don't hear your voices, we do hear your messages. Okay, thanks a lot, Daniel.
No, thank you very much, Kerry. Thank you. Bye bye.